welcome back everyone to a Saturday special edition of the School of Faith. My name's Hutch, and if you guys haven't done so yet, please do subscribe to the channel, and if you're finding any of this helpful, you can feel free to like the video. Also, if you guys have thoughts or comments of your own, leave them down below in the comment section. So, now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, last night I was doing some reading, and I had something of an epiphany. Because as you know, if you guys have been watching any of the previous videos, you know that I've been trying to think through this larger, or maybe not larger, let me rephrase that. I've been trying to think about the phenomenon that surrounds Jordan Peterson, and on a deeper level, maybe the phenomenon that's given rise to Jordan Peterson's popularity. And as I was thinking about that last night, a number of light bulbs went off for me. And so, as I've said in a previous video, I think it's a mistake to see Dr. Peterson as a political figure. I think that that's wrong-headed. And one of the things that is, you might call it a personal conviction of mine, is that culture drives politics, not the other way around. So politics doesn't drive culture. Culture is, in fact, driven by politics. And I think if you reverse those two things, you wind up with some rather mistaken thinking. And so as I was kind of mulling some of that over last night, one of the strands that suddenly connected itself for me was the issues that have cropped up in the last, say, 48 to 72 hours with what's being called the Vox Adpocalypse. And for those of you who aren't aware, it's this sort of controversy that originally began surrounding Steven Crowder and his channel. He was called out, you might say, by Carlos Maza, who is a journalist for Vox that's done a lot of videos for them. And that has then spilled over across YouTube to the demonetization of other channels that had nothing to do with the initial conflict between Carlos Maza and Steven Crowder. And frankly, they don't really have anything to do with the larger cultural piece. Channels that were completely innocent have just been swept up in this. But the reality is, as I was thinking about this last night, is that I think that this issue with Vox and Steven Crowder and Carlos Maza is not the problem. It's the symptom of, or we might say it's a function of the larger metapolitical, or again, better, I think, metacultural context that we're finding ourselves in. And so if we step back and we kind of look at the much larger picture, then one of the things that sort of rises to the surface is this question of political polarization as it exists in the United States right now. And so if all you had to go on was legacy media, then you would be left with the idea that what's happened is that there has been this far-right shift that has occurred in U.S. politics, where the Republicans in the U.S. have just been driven further and further towards the extreme edge, while the Democrats have stayed more or less centrist, or what we might call center-left. And that's actually not the case. And so if you look at the data from Pew Research, which I'm going to include in the video, what you'll see is that the shift towards the extreme ideological edge is actually happening on the left. It's not happening on the right, which is not to say that there hasn't been a certain amount of rightward shift in the Republican Party, but that rightward shift is negligible compared to the left liberal shift in the Democratic Party. And this polarization, or this larger metacultural shift, is being driven, in my estimation, by a cultural and political minority that has an influence that is far larger than its size. And so if you were just looking at the numerical value, you might say percentage-wise, of these voices compared to the larger population of the United States, then what you would discover is that this is a very, very small group of people, and it tends to be centered in large coastal cities. So, for example, Silicon Valley, Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York City, Atlanta, and these tend to be the cities where both media and tech congregate. And so then what happens is that as people are drawn into these large coastal cities, then that in turn tends to produce this echo chamber, or what we might call a bubble effect, where you have a largely liberal area of the country that then attracts people that are largely ideologically left liberal. And then they're all talking to each other and going, oh my gosh, can you believe this? And then that produces this explosion that's led it to look like that the larger cultural shift is moving right, not left. And that's not the case. The numbers simply don't bear that out. And then as a function of all of that is that the individuals that are the gatekeepers to these larger, tech companies, legacy media, and even alternative media like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Periscope, and others, they then take their particular worldview, for lack of a better way to put it, as normative, and then any deviation from that worldview is seen as regressive or fascist or that sort of thing. And that's the reason that I think you see relatively moderate cultural figures that are on the conservative end of the spectrum getting described as Nazis. And then I think that that's a symptom, or we might nutshell that symptom, we could say this way, it's that what's happening is that these individuals are mistaking their bubble as being representative of all of culture. And so I think that mistake can be seen, actually, if you want to drive down on the political side of it, in the US Electoral Map from the 2016 presidential election, which I'm also going to include here in the video. And so what we see is that you have these coastal urban areas that are predominantly liberal and left liberal that are surrounded by oceans of red. Now, some of those portions of that ocean, we might say, is going to be a lighter red than some areas where it's going to be a much darker red. But nonetheless, these tend to be islands surrounded by oceans of red. The more intriguing thing to me in this on the political level, or again, better yet, we might step back and say on the meta-political level, is the fact that for most people that are genuinely right-wing, the Republican Party actually isn't right-wing at all. It would be seen as something much closer to a slightly less liberal tail that's attached to a much larger and more liberal dog. And so it's not genuinely right-wing in the sense of a European right or right-wing political party at all. And I think that it would not be unfair to say that there probably hasn't really been a right-wing party in the sense of the European right wing in the U.S. Since at least 1960, and probably well before that. I mean, it would depend on whether or not you take the Populist Party that ran William Jennings Bryan as their presidential candidate in the early 1900s. It would depend on whether or not you took them as being a right-wing party in the European sense. And the issue there is that the American right very self-consciously calls themselves conservative, whereas the European right sees themselves as traditionalist. And there's a really big difference between those two ways of seeing yourself and way of seeing your own worldview. And so, and I think that also, just in my opinion, is extraordinarily easily demonstrated. Because if you look at the American right and the figures that are the most vocal on the American right, so just as an example, we could say, well, because he's been at the center of this controversy, say Steven Crowder, Ted Cruz, so Rand Paul, Mitch McConnell, and then you compare those to folks on the European right. Right, you compare them to folks like Alain de Benoit or Guillaume Fay, and the European Nouvelle Droite, or the new right. Compare that to the Republican Party, and there's a massive ideological difference between these two movements. Now, there are surface similarities, sure, but on a much deeper level, they don't bear a lot of resemblance to each other. Although the American alt-right does in fact bear a much closer resemblance to the European Nouvelle Droite. So we are seeing a certain amount of conversation that's going on back and forth between the American alt-right and the European Nouvelle Droite. And I think that all of that is kind of this larger metacultural environment, or this much bigger pot of metacultural stew. And what's bubbling up from that has been most recently seen in the Vox Adpocalypse. And that's an interesting phenomenon just in its own right. First, because of the, we might say, the combatant parties that are involved in this. So on the one hand, you have Steven Crowder, a straight white male conservative Second Amendment supporter, so on and so forth. And on the other side, you have Carlos Maza, who is a I don't know if he would call himself gay or queer, but for the sake of this video, we'll say that he's a gay Hispanic man, or if you wanted to use the more common language now in our cultural milieu, it would be he's a queer person of color. And so these two are the co-belligerents, or not co-belligerents, we'll say that they're the belligerents in this particular phenomenon. And so this has led to a, and I don't want to call this a tempest in a teapot, because I think that that would be a mischaracterization, but this has led to a conflict that has become very vocal, right? And so you're seeing it, come up in Tim Pool's videos at Timcast, obviously. Steven Crowder did a big video thing about it yesterday, which I haven't watched. I can't sit through an hour or an hour and a half of that guy. I just can't pull it off. It becomes tedious for me. But you've also see it raised to the level of legacy media. So they were talking about it on CNN and on Fox News. I cannot think of the guy's name. It just escaped me. He's a real well-known commentator for CNN. He's on their evening news, a black guy whose name is escaping me. And then on the more conservative news outlet side, the other guy that was talking about it, it's the guy with the shaggy hair, white guy. Can't think of his name either right now. But at any rate, this has risen to the level of cultural awareness, and it's made its way into legacy media. And what's happening is that you've seen this move initially to deplatform Steven Crowder. But what that's turned into is a response by YouTube that really didn't satisfy anybody, where now Steven Crowder's channel has just been demonetized, but then in this big sweep to enforce, new harassment or hate speech codes, or whatever it is however it is that you want to characterize that. Other non-related channels have gotten swept up in this. And so I actually would say that this is feeding into a larger conversation that's happening culturally in the United States, particularly about questions of free speech, censorship, hate speech codes. But that itself, I think, is an expression of a larger question about rights generally. And so I think that on an even deeper level, all of the conversation that we're having about free speech, hate speech, those sorts of things, they're symptoms of a bigger problem that no one's really confronted yet. And I think that if we see this as just a conflict between free speech and censorship, for example, as it's being characterized by the American right, is a significant error. Because I think at a deeper level, there is on the American left, especially on the left liberal edge, a deeper suspicion of anything like what I would characterize as freedom rights at all. And so what I mean when I talk about freedom rights is this. So the word, right is used in a way that is not always terribly clear when we're talking about someone has a right to this. Okay, so the way that that word right gets used, I think, can be broken down into a number of categories. So we would say that we may be talking about a freedom right. Another way that we might think about this is that we could be talking about a benefit right. Um, and so, and then on another level, we have what we might call a non-discrimination right. So if we were talking about a freedom right, for example, then what we would say is that with a freedom right, a person is free to act without coercion, and others have the corresponding duty of forbearance towards his or her decisions, and that the state, for instance, has a corresponding duty to refrain from interfering with this particular action. So that would be a freedom right. And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about the right to free speech. But then we have what we might call a benefit right. And so in the case of a benefit right, we're talking about a person. So with a benefit right, we are asserting that a person has the right to receive something from another person or group who has a corresponding duty to provide it and thereby satisfy that right. And so an example of that would be the alleged right to welfare or to government support. And so when we say that someone has a right to welfare, what we're saying is that some people have the right to an income, and that other people have the corresponding right, or pardon me, that other people have the corresponding duty to provide that income. And then when we start talking about non-discrimination rights, we're saying that when someone has a non-discrimination right, that society or other individuals are obligated not to regard adversely something about this individual when they're, for example, seeking employment or seeking housing or seeking military service. And so what we're saying is that this individual has the right to be free from discrimination on the basis of, race, nation of origin, gender, etc., and that none of those things can be used to regard them adversely when we're extending opportunities to them. And so one of the larger problems that we've got right now in the US is that when we use the word right, we're not using it in a way that makes it clear what sort of right we're talking about. And so on the right, on the American political right, we're hearing a lot about free speech and a lot about censorship. And then on the American left, what we're hearing a lot of is a lot of talk about systemic racism, systemic oppression, rape culture, the patriarchy, hate speech. But in reality, all of those things are surface issues. The deeper issue, I think, is the very concept of freedom rights. And I think that's the larger issue that has to be confronted. And I think that that actually gets at what's at the deepest level of this metacultural conflict that's going on. Because I think that at the deepest level, this conflict is actually about the source of rights. And I think once you really drill down all the way, the big conflict is over the source of rights. Because you have the sort of, I don't want to equivocate here, but we might say a traditional American Enlightenment understanding of rights being given by the Creator, and then you have a newer phenomenon of an attempt to build an entirely secular basis for rights. And I think that those two things are profoundly in conflict with each other. And I think all of these threads and all of these streams, when you bring them together, go towards explaining why it is that Jordan Peterson has become such a lightning rod for controversy culturally. Because he is asking the deepest question that's being asked publicly right now, which is not to say that I think that he's getting all the way to the root of the problem. I don't think he is. But I think among those voices on what has been characterized as the intellectual dark web, Peterson is asking the deepest questions. And I think that he's getting close to the deepest issue in this question of the source of rights. And the way that he's driving at it is that he's looking at the I'll try and use the language that I think that he would use. He was looking at the larger mythological basis for Western culture and Western values. And I think that that's really important. And I don't think that, and I've got a whole video that's in the work about this. I think it would be unfair to characterize Dr. Peterson as using the term myth or mythological in a pejorative sense. He's not. He's using it in a very different sense than it being pejorative. But I do think that he's starting to reach down to those deeper levels of the cultural currents that are happening. And I think that that goes towards explaining the phenomenon that's around him, first on the controversy side, and second on the larger draw that he has towards a certain segment of the population. Because I think that we recognize, perhaps in a way that we're unable to articulate, that this cultural conflict goes much, much deeper than the vast majority of people are realizing. So I hope all of that helps. I hope that this video maybe helps you tie some thoughts together. Once again, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And by all means, please do leave me a comment in the comment section below if you have questions or thoughts of your own. So God bless, and everybody have an outstanding day and weekend. Bye-bye.